Why, hello there. From Software is known for having an attention to detail in their games, making very conscious decisions about how they build their worlds. They evoke real-world history, culture, and other works of art as a way to visually convey meaning. One way they do this is through the use of historical architecture, sometimes almost recreations, to reference a time and culture in our world that we can translate into their games for additional meaning, understanding, and richness in the worlds of their games. And Elden Ring is certainly no exception. When I am not making videos about the world and story of Elden Ring, I work as an architect, and I thought it would be fun to bring the two together and use my architectural knowledge to explore the architecture of Elden Ring. I'm starting with Castle Morne because not only is it likely one of the first major locations players will reach, but it is also a fairly clear example of Romanesque architecture. Let's get into it. As mentioned, Castle Morne is designed using the Romanesque style of architecture. Romanesque, or Norman architecture, was the first style to rise in prominence across Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire a few hundred years prior. The style was not officially named until the Renaissance and was originally intended as a pejorative to imply that it was like Roman architecture, but not as good. Romanesque is also referred to as Norman architecture, primarily in England, because the Norman conquest of 1088 by William the Conqueror brought the style to England. Romanesque architecture is defined broadly by thick walls, semicircular arches, barrel vaults, and large towers. Castle Morne has the following characteristics that denote it as Romanesque. The castle features small, semicircular windows. It also has thick stone walls supporting the structure. The conical roofs of the towers are relatively flat, compared to what you'd see with later Gothic spires. There are no barrel vaults to see, as the castle on the interior and exterior is pretty plain, but even this plainness suggests an earlier Romanesque construction, which focused more on defense and function, and less on ornamentation like carvings and sculptures. As far as I can tell, Castle Morne is not directly inspired by a particular castle, but it does bear a resemblance to Lindisfarne, Bamberg, and other castles in the Northumberland county of northern England. Before we unpack what From Software might be conveying with these Romanesque elements, I want to spend a moment to more broadly discuss what game devs might use Romanesque architecture to convey in a fictional setting. Besides being associated with the cultural image of a European medieval castle, Romanesque architecture was the first major style following the Dark Ages that occurred in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. So this style could represent a transitive period of rebuilding following a tumultuous age, and could carry some prejudice as being lesser than what came before and what would come after it. Romanesque architecture was a transitive style, holding on to many features of Roman architecture while beginning to become more distinct. This would eventually give birth to Gothic architecture, which employed advancements in vaulting and the development of pointed arches and flying buttresses that allowed for more grandiose vertical buildings with larger openings. So Romanesque architecture could represent a culture or place as older or less advanced than those featuring Gothic architecture. And then finally, Romanesque architecture is also heavily associated with Christianity, generally being considered the first Christian architectural style. As I mentioned before, Norman architecture spread through England following conquest, and it primarily spread in the construction of churches. So I could see it being used in a way to evoke a burgeoning religious presence tied into conquest. So how is it used for Castle Morne? Most obviously, it is used to evoke the cultural image we have of a European castle to evoke medieval Europe, but I think it is also illustrating Castle Morne as an older, less advanced, and perhaps more singularly functional space the last of which I will expand upon later. Castle Morne is within sight of Stormvale Castle, which features both Romanesque and Gothic architecture. Stormvale is comparatively highly ornamented, which to me suggests a later period Gothic renovation as further advancements allowed for more extravagant ornamentation. On top of this, later period Gothic castles became status symbols as much as fortified centers of power, but that's for another video. The contrast with Castle Morne's minimal ornamentation further illustrates Morne as a place built with intention and to serve a function, and not the home of a wealthy lord. Which brings us to the story of Castle Morne. In Smotown's Elden Ring timeline video, he suggests that Castle Morne was built by a man seeking revenge, and I think the architecture supports this. The grafted blade greatsword tells the story of Castle Morne. The storied sword of Castle Morne, a revenger's weapon, it is burdened with oceans of anger and regret. One of the legendary armaments. A lone surviving champion from a country now vanished was so determined to continue fighting that he claimed the swords of an entire clan of warriors. Additionally, the sword monument outside of Castle Morne states, "The siege of Castle Morne, a lone hero fights for his vengeance, only to fall at the hand of Lord Godfrey." I would strongly encourage you to check out Smotown's video for more information, but in short, he asserts that the Revenger, wielding his clan's swords in the form of the grafted blade greatsword, built Castle Morne as he crossed the sea for revenge on Hoaralou, aka Godfrey, for killing his clan. Before moving on to how I think the architecture supports this, I want to point out one detail that I discovered that conflicts. You can see here a couple stone carvings of the Erd tree. It could be an inconsistency, so it might be a moot point, but if it's intentional, it suggests to me two possibilities. You could explain this as something added after the castle was taken, which is possible, but it could also suggest that Castle Morne was built by the forces of the Erd tree, and it was the Revenger and forces who besieged the castle. And in fact, that was the stance I held for a long time, until further investigating the design. Let me explain how the architecture swayed me to believe that it was the Revenger who built Castle Morne. The design of the castle suggests that it is defending from an attack by land, not by sea. The outer wall of the castle defends against forces coming from the Weeping Peninsula and Limgrave, but contained within the ward are multiple beaches giving easy access to the castle from the sea. The placement of this wall cuts Morne off from the rest of the peninsula, with no further walls to protect them from the sea, and no ruins to suggest there may have once been more wall along the coast. And the wall itself is heavily damaged, indicating those who besieged the castle were attacking not from the sea, but from Limgrave to the north. And lastly, there is the gravesite. The gravesite, the most sacred space in Castle Morne, is right at sea level, which would be a terrible spot if an attack was expected from the sea. Furthermore, there is a gate standing between the castle and the gravesite, but nothing protecting it from the side of the sea, telling me that this gate was a last barrier for anyone coming from the castle and the Weeping Peninsula beyond. The takeaway here is that the design of Castle Morne suggests a place built by a force coming from the sea and taking a foothold in the lands between, not as a fortification to defend the lands between from a naval force. Before wrapping up this video, I have just a few other comments about the architecture of Castle Morne. Castle Morne is pretty sparse when it comes to living quarters, with few buildings and no real great hall or keep to speak of. Morne's primary function is as a dungeon encounter for Elden Ring, and therefore level design is what drives the layout of the castle, but I think this further depicts Morne as a place built to serve its function as a fortification, and not much more. I also wanted to point out the hoardings, these wooden structures projecting beyond the stone towers. They were built to give better views and protected access to the ground below during a siege. This detail complements the history of the castle and the siege that occurred, and these broken and battered remnants, and of course the destroyed towers, hint toward the outcome of the siege. And to answer what I imagine will be a comment if I don't say something, the elevator and location of Castle Morne high atop a cliff is the result of it being a fantasy game and a compelling landmark that can be seen from far away. There were pulley elevators during the time of Romanesque architecture, but nothing as tall or as large as what we see in Castle Morne. And finally, Castle Morne features a handful of Gothic windows that don't match the other Romanesque openings, and I don't know why. If I was to come up with an in-game reason, maybe they were part of a renovation after the castle was taken, along with the Erd Tree carvings. They are in the same location as the Erd Tree ornamentation, so it's not outside the realm of possibility. And there you have it, the architecture of Castle Morne. This is a little bit of a different video for me, so if you enjoyed it and want more of this sort of content, I strongly encourage you to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment so that I can see that there is an interest in Elden Ring architectural analysis. Thanks for watching.